All right. Good evening, everyone, and good morning to our partners and friends in Japan, in New Zealand, Contact Energy and the team. Have a happy Friday. I'm Marie Lingbeck, Senior Partnership Manager at Plug and Play Energy team, and welcome to the fourth energy webinar of this year. So this time around, we are very excited to focus on a topic that's been really high on the agenda for all of our corporate partners that are aiming to reach net zero carbon emissions. So for today's topic, innovation in carbon capture, offset, and utilization, we have invited two very knowledgeable people to open up the topic. Jim Giles, Senior Analyst at Greenpeace Group, and Alexander Rosenfield, founder of Climate Impact Capital. After that, we will hear from our 5 amazing startups that will present their technologies. And before we kick it off, a few housekeeping rules. Once you've signed into this webinar, you will be automatically muted. However, we encourage you to submit questions to our speakers and startups. So please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Every startup will have 4 minutes for their presentation, followed by a 2-minute Q&A. And at the end of this 1-hour webinar, our speakers will stay online for the next 15 minutes to answer any of your additional questions. So please feel free to use these 15 minutes to network with our speakers and startups. And for those of you who are not familiar with Plug and Play, we are an active early stage investor and a corporate open innovation platform. And what that means is that we connect startups with corporations, VCs, mentors, and so on, all with an aim to bring new emerging technologies to the market faster. We have 36 locations around the world. Energy program was launched in Silicon Valley 3 years ago. We also operate energy program in Houston, in Beijing, in Shanghai, in China, and in several of our smart cities locations in Europe. As for our own investment activities, we are an early stage investor, and how we really evaluate the success of our portfolio is that around 70% of our startups have been able to raise follow-on funding, and around 1% has reached unicorn status. A couple of examples here, you'll see Hippo, Rappi, and 26, and so on. And with that, before we start, I really want to thank our partners for your support. It's been an exciting journey to work with you on some of the most pressing issues in the energy sector. So I hope you really enjoy this session today. And without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Jim Giles, Senior Analyst and Conference Chair for Food and Carbon System at the Greenpeace Group, and Jim will be your moderator today. Jim, please take it away.
Hi, Marit. Thanks for that. And thanks so much to Plug and Play for bringing this really fantastic group of startups and companies together. I think it's really important that we're having this conversation because if you go and ask people about the technologies that we're using to tackle climate change, most likely they're going to start telling you about solar and wind and the other technologies we're using to decarbonize the grid, or maybe they're going to mention some of the EV technologies being developed at Tesla and elsewhere that are being used to electrify the transportation sector. There's actually, in addition to these super important technologies, there's another critical suite of technologies that we can use to capture, to utilize, and to sequester carbon for the long term. This suite of technologies has got far less attention. In fact, if you go back just 10 years or so, you find an almost complete lack of interest in these technologies from policymakers and investors, and even a sense that these are far too expensive, and maybe a kind of feeling that they're a moral hazard and that these technologies are actually some kind of excuse that will allow fossil fuel companies to continue to pump CO2 into the atmosphere. For anyone that's familiar with those technologies, they'll know that that perception was always misguided, and I'm really excited about the change that we're seeing. We are seeing a surge of interest from entrepreneurs, from investors, and from policymakers in these technologies, and I think they're set to make a really big impact. And it's absolutely essential that they do. And so to kind of set the scene a little bit here and explain just why they're so important, I am really excited to have Alex Rosenfeld, who is the managing director and founder of Climate Impact Capital, to tell us a little bit more about these technologies. So over to you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Jim, and I'm very excited to be here with our partners at Plug and Play, who do an incredible job of curating things for corporates and other stakeholders. Just to give a little background on Climate Impact Capital, for those that I haven't worked with, we formed Climate Impact Capital 4 years ago with the mission to address the early stage capital gap, which you're very well familiar with, and it's very much of concern, especially for hardware technologies that take a long time to develop. And we work really almost exclusively with large corporations, both oil and gas and power, around helping them understand the strategies and the types of investments that they can do to manage their scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions around with a focus of climate mitigation, but also transitioning to the new energy economy. So very much aligned with what Plug and Play is doing and bringing technologies and opportunities into the corporate world where there can be so much of an impact. So what we had discussed, Jim, is maybe we thought we'd give our audience a little bit of background, because not everyone is familiar with all the details about why we're looking at this and how this is relevant to industry. So just to start, this is analysis that some may have seen. It's a combination. This information is coming from the IEA, and what we wanted to highlight here is where the emissions are coming from industry. We know we have a lot of industry and corporate partners on the webinar today, and I think for the majority of you, you will kind of see that you fit into one of these areas. So specifically what you see is power generation, industry in general, transport, and buildings make up the bulk of the emissions in one way or other. And these are the CO2 emissions, so it doesn't capture land use. This is more around industry. And what the scenario is that this is the IEA clean technology scenario. So this is looking at a world where policy is already driving a lot of changes, and industries are responding very actively to this. But what you also see is that things don't change quite as much. And what I wanted to really point out here is that this is because, as our participants know, we are locked into a lot of technologies. And this is what this graph is showing, is that power plants have been built, chemical plants have been built, cars have been sold. And this is the lock-in of current technology, and shows how much CO2 we still have to deal with, even as we try to decarbonize, and if we pretty much bring every single molecule going forward and several EVs going forward that are clean tech. So this shows the scale of the challenge. So we can go to the next slide. So many of you will have been familiar with the carbon budget. And what I just wanted to overlay is, the so what to, yes, we're stuck with, in a good or bad way, with so many assets on the books. Many of these assets, especially on the oil and gas side, and then also in heavy transport and power, are 40, 50-year-old assets. Well, the so what is, how much carbon do we have left to emit if we're going to have a chance of not going over a threshold? And this is called the carbon budget. So if we are to not go over a 1.5 degree carbon budget, and the axis for that is on the right, we really don't have much time. This is really 10 years left on the budget. And from most notional ways of doing that, it's going to be almost impossible to reach that. And a 2 degree carbon budget, as you see, that extends the time frame for a longer time, but it's still going to be challenging to meet that. So from a point of a carbon budget, if you're concerned as a corporation that there'll be policy around that, this gives you a little bit feeling for the time frame. And if we go to the last slide that I wanted to show for framing, what it also illustrates that if we're looking at a 1.5 degree carbon budget by 2031, all the rest of the carbon in the system, the order of 25 gigatons per year, would have to be captured by CCUS or direct air capture or something else, which both shows you the scope of the challenge, but also I think for the purposes of this call and the webinar, the scope of the opportunity, right? This is a great opportunity to bring in new technologies to meet the challenge and to give a kind of a threshold for how big the opportunity is. Right now in the US, there's only about 25 million tons per annum of carbon being captured and utilized. And this number is in gigatons. So there's a 1,000-fold increase of market opportunity to be had just in this next 10 years. So from that aspect, I'm very bullish on the opportunity for CCUS to create value. So hopefully that gives a bit of a framework for the what, who's impacted, what the timeframes are, and what the opportunity is for CCUS.
Thanks, Alex. I think that's really clear, and it really shows the urgency here. You know, this is the IPCC telling us that we simply cannot avoid the really bad impacts of climate change without this technology. So let's move on and think about the technologies itself. So what does it mean? We talk about capturing, utilizing, and storing carbon. What does that mean in practice? How do we do that?
So you know, there's the three parts of CCUS. So the carbon capture is where a lot of the technology focus has been for many years. This has been a traditional part of the oil and gas industry where they've been using what called amine technologies to capture the CO2 and use it for various different processes, often in oil and gas enhanced oil recovery. A lot of traditional technology in place, but a lot of new technologies coming in, such as direct air capture. So there's a lot of mix coming into that. But fundamentally, it's about capturing the CO2. What's important for people to recognize is where you capture it is important because moving CO2 is very expensive. No one really wants to have a new pipeline built in their backyard. It's very hard to permit these things. And then you need to do something with it. And that goes to the two other parts, utilization and sequestration. We really like the idea of utilization. You know, there'll be a couple of companies on today's call that do that. So you take the CO2 and you make something useful from it, which gives you the notion that perhaps you can get paid for that. And with that payment, you can offset the cost of capturing it. Sequestration is basically putting it in a saline reservoir, hopefully for 1,000 years or more, or using it for enhanced oil recovery, which is what is done by the oil and gas companies. And here in the US, there's a tax credit called 45Q that gives credits to either oil and gas companies or others who perform that sequestration or use in EOR.
So how do you see the opportunities for corporations? I mean, obviously some of them are clear. You talked about some of the larger industrial processes like the steel industry and the ethanol industry. There's a need there for capture at source. But what about the wider corporate world? What are the opportunities for them to get involved in these technologies? Well,
certainly the capture at source is, you know, if you're going to call anything a low-hanging fruit, that would be it, where there's large source points of carbon coming from petrochemical facilities and from power plants. And that's where a lot of the focus has been, especially from the Department of Energy. We're very interested in circular economy opportunities there of taking that carbon, especially here in the Gulf Coast, and reusing that into chemicals and materials and basically decarbonizing at least part of the value chain. So I think that's certainly one of the biggest opportunities if you are a major CO2 producer. And I think that's where a lot of the innovation is happening right now. For other industries that are more point source, it becomes more of a challenge. So if you even look at, say, at oil and gas, certainly there are emissions upstream to the process, but the majority of the emissions are at the use, and it's going to be impossible to capture that. And I think that's where we're seeing the story of and challenge on the oil and gas side are, do they move to electric vehicles and decarbonizing through electrification of transport, or do they go and invest into carbon capture technologies for natural gas or even coal? And that's going to be the fundamental part on the electrification of the grid and the electrification of transport.
And you mentioned the circular carbon economy, which I think is something that's getting an increasing amount of attention. It's a really exciting vision. It's this idea that instead of having a linear economy around carbon, we extract oil from the ground and then use it and to do useful things with it. And then it ends up often as CO2 in the atmosphere. We can start to build a circular economy where we might, for example, pull CO2 from the atmosphere and use it to produce, in principle, anything from jet fuel to plastics. This sounds great. It's obviously not the way we're doing things right now. Why is that? What are the barriers between where we are now and an economy like that?
Well, it's challenging. Anytime you're integrating large processes, there's a lot of corporate barriers to changing how you're doing things. Just starting with the simple ones of creating a circular economy, right where you have in petrochemicals and you have large sources. I think in the US and in Asia, that's going to be the first part of the circular economy, especially around plastics, capturing CO2 from something like an ethylene plant or polyethylene. There's a lot of CO2 there, and that carbon can go directly into plastics. And at the same time, we can begin recycling a plastic through those same processes where you take the old plastic, pyrolyze or gasify it and begin putting that in. So not only are you capturing any emissions, but you're creating a circular economy with the goods as well. So I think we're going to see it first in that place. Direct air capture is a little bit of another story. Certainly there's a lot of excitement about it, but the cost of direct air capture right now is 3 to 4 times more than it is to capture the CO2 from a large petrochemical facility. So if you're going to be capturing at near where you're going to use it for petrochemicals or for plastics or for any other goods, you might as well capture it at the place where you're emitting it first. With direct air capture, what we're seeing right now is they're using it in probably the biggest project right now is with Occidental and Carbon Engineering, where they committed to a 1 million ton per annum project to do enhanced oil recovery. And it makes more sense there where they're capturing it from the air and they're not trying to ship it across the country to the use there. But there's a long way to go on that technology, but it provides a lot of potential benefits if we think about the future of advanced manufacturing, where if you can capture CO2 efficiently anywhere, here's the big and, you can have an efficient way of using renewable energy to create other products anywhere, then you become creating a new type of economy. But I think that's still a bit further away.
Great, thanks, Alex. So we're moving towards towards hearing from the startups. We've had a couple of questions from the audience I just want to put to you before we hear from the startups. So Paul Ebert has a great question on what he calls the social license concerns. I think this is the sort of moral hazard issue that I refer to. And Paul says the court of public opinion is a tough one, and CCS has a tough road to convince. He can't see us meeting the decarbonization challenge without it, but we can't underestimate the social challenge. And I think that's really true. And I'm kind of waiting for a backlash towards these technologies, which I haven't seen yet, but I could totally see it coming. What do we need to do to convince the wider world of policymakers and the general public that these technologies are important and should be deployed at scale?
Well, I think part of it is to convince the public that they're not going to be paying for this, or at least the public that is going to be most impacted. So this is not regressive. So, one way that's happening right now is, of course, is that basically subsidies from the federal governments in terms of tax credits, and those tax credits basically come from could be coming from corporates that are paying taxes and from more of a progressive tax base versus if the oil and gas companies or the petrochemical companies or the steel companies were having to put that on everyone. So just kind of as a feel for how, you know, how much that could impact things and why this is so important is I just did some back of the envelope calculations, and using, let's say, the cost of direct air capture, if that was applied to oil and gas as an offset for people's vehicles, that could increase the price of gasoline at the pump by as much as 50–60%. If we were applying a carbon capture technology to a natural gas plant, for an average consumer, that could increase their price by 15–25%, and on an industry level as well. So this is the big fear, not just in the US and others, is that the people who are going to be paying for this are the people who have the least ability to do that. So same as what we're having in the COVID-19 impact. So I think that the road to haul is that the oil and gas companies, the petrochemicals, the utilities, as well as the government, needs to invest in technologies that allow these costs to fall significantly enough that the corporations can absorb the cost without passing it on to the public. And the only way you can do that is by creating these integrated R&D plans, investing into the future right now, and not waiting, you know, 10 years, you know, for the other shoe to fall when there's a $50–60 carbon tax.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Let's just, one final question before we go to the startups. Let's just go back to direct air capture and the costs, because it's such a nascent technology that there are very few data points on the cost curve for the technology. But what we do see on that cost curve, I see personally as ground for optimism. You know, we've gone from a situation where it was several thousands of dollars per ton, down to, and this is based on projections, but relating to the Oxy project that you talked about, certainly less than 200 and you know, maybe less than $100 per ton. Still a lot. It's a great deal more expenses than other forms of offsets. But this is a cost curve, and as we get more data points, we hope it will come down even further. Where do you know, when you think about the companies and the investment and the technologies involved, where do you think we can get to in, say, the next 10 or 20 years?
Well, so using traditional carbon capture techniques, CO2 capture techniques, you can see it, you know, in the $40 range, but that's for technologies that are getting very concentrated CO2 in the 50–80% range. So just with those mechanics there, you know, it's going to be, I think, in the 50 range, you know, 50–60 range if things get good. But I think what's kind of, you know, missing, and just wanted to add to that, is even if we got direct air capture and everything down to $20–30, it still begs the question of who's going to pay that. So we need to create technologies that take that CO2 and make that into edible protein that's selling for, you know, $5,000 a ton, into cement products, into steel, into plastics. All of these commodities are selling for $500 to $2,000 a ton. And then it doesn't matter if you're creating a product that's over $200 a ton. It doesn't matter if you're paying $50 a ton or $100 a ton for the capture. So that's why we're very bullish about finding ways to use it, because if we find great ways to create materials, we can do direct air capture anywhere, because we have a product that we can make that has a value of 5, 10, 20 times more than what it costs to capture the CO2.
Yeah. Great. Thanks so much, Alex. So Alex and I are going to hang around at the end for another 15 minutes or so if there's anyone interested in firing questions at us and continuing this conversation. But for now, we have a fantastic group of startups assembled. So let's hear from them.
Hello, everyone. So first off, thank you all for joining. My name is Alberto, and I'm part of the Energy Futures team, working alongside colleagues Noreen and Mirad. So I'll be your MC tonight. For this event, we will be having 4 amazing technologies in the carbon capture and storage space, and one stellar company wrapping up in the carbon offsetting space. So a few housekeeping rules. So if you want to submit any questions, feel free to do so while the presentations go on through the Q&A box. And if you have any questions for the panelists, feel free to type those in the chat. So without any further ado, let's welcome Valentin and NEUSTARK presenting.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Valentin from NEUSTARK, and we enable the production of net zero emissions concrete. The net zero formula really provides the framework for everything we do at NEUSTARK. So net zero emissions mean that whatever emissions we cannot avoid, we have to address through negative emissions, permanently removed from the atmosphere and safely stored. Now, concrete and cement with about 3 billion tons of CO2 emitted annually are, as of today, clearly on this left problem arrow. And I want to show you today how we can move it step by step to this right side solution arrow. So with our solution at NEUSTARK, we integrate seamlessly in the existing concrete recycling process. So demolished concrete is actually the world's most voluminous waste stream. It's collected at the construction site and then typically delivered to concrete recycling sites where the material is crushed and sieved and then reused for the production of recycled concrete. So we go from chunks of concrete into a finer aggregate that you see on the right. So this is happening as of today. Where NEUSTARK comes in is that we also deliver liquid CO2 to the concrete recycling site. We store it there in stationary tanks so that it can be contacted under controlled conditions inside our reactors with the crushed and demolished concrete. So what's happening there is that the CO2 is permanently transformed into calcium carbonate, so limestone, which can be added to the concrete mix and there replace about 10% of the cement, which makes the whole process economical. It also enables there to get to a net zero emissions concrete, which works as follows. What you see here on the left is a high-level concrete mix design with NEUSTARK. So in 1 cubic meter of concrete, we have mostly aggregate and then calcium carbonate, and most importantly, clinker, which is the glue that sticks everything else together. So clinker is really the climate problem. During its production, a lot of CO2 is emitted, about 150 kilograms per cubic meter of concrete. So firstly, with NEUSTARK, you need less of that clinker, which makes it economical. And then we also add a lot of embodied CO2 in the form of calcium carbonate to the mix. And like that, we can compensate for the clinker emissions, getting to a net zero emissions concrete. Now, what we see happening towards 2030 is that clinker will be produced at the cement plant using carbon capture and storage, so it will come with a close to neutral carbon footprint. And at this stage, our solution enables concrete to become a material that binds significantly more CO2 than it produces during its production, which we think is spectacular. What you see here is a rendering of our commercial pilot plant that we commissioned this summer in Bern, Switzerland. The company was founded by Johannes Tiefenthaler and myself. Also in the management team are Roman Vatter and Marcel Eckstein, responsible for finance and production. We are a spin-off of ETH Zurich and supported by the Swiss Federal Office for the Environment, as well as through the European Union through the program Climate Kick. So going back to our initial equation, we really want to transform concrete as a product from emitting billions of tons of CO2 towards binding billions of tons of CO2. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valentin, for introducing us to NEUSTARK. Do we have you on the line?
I guess so. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you great. Wonderful. So thank you so much for joining at this time. We have a couple of questions from the audience. So first question is, what is your business model?
Okay, so we have two groups of customers and partners. One group are CO2 certificate customers who buy the CO2 storage or the negative emission that we create in our process. And then the other partner customer group are the concrete producers who, in the first step, buy our technology. Then they use it in their production process, and we basically redistribute our CO2 certificate revenues to a certain extent back to those concrete producers so that they're incentivized to store CO2.
Great. So the next question is what are the costs associated with bringing CO2 into the mix, and how are you finding financial feasibility? You mentioned a bit about that in one of your last slides, but can you cover a bit more?
Sure. So concrete generally is a very location-dependent business. So there's different market dynamics for all costs of concrete production. But generally speaking, if we get this 10% cement reduction, at least for European cement prices, what we see, the process then can just pay off. If it doesn't, that's where the CO2 certificates kick in. That can then bridge this delta to an economic solution.
Wonderful. So the last questions from the audience is, how is the competitor landscape looking?
So there's a bunch of initiatives going on in the field of carbonation of mineral wastes, which is how I would define our broader market. In the field of concrete, certainly Carbon Cure is very prominent and commercially successful. So what we do actually complements quite nicely with them. So they carbonate the fresh concrete and we carbonate demolished concrete, so you can really run both of those simultaneously. And then really in the specific field of carbonation of demolished concrete, there's Blue Planet from the US developing comparable solution. And I think we differentiate by having a solution that really integrates into existing processes, which can be deployed right away.
Great. Great. So I think that's all. If you have any remaining questions, feel free to add them in the Q&A box, and Valentin will be either answering them today or we will follow up with him tomorrow. Just wanted to thank Valentin for joining us tonight. I know it's very late, so have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much for having me. Looking forward also to your further questions and reach outs.
Wonderful. So up next, we have Moji presenting Semvita Factory from Houston.
Semvita Factory started with a simple idea, and that was to mimic photosynthesis, to go from CO2 to glucose. And the first application was for deep space exploration, to use the CO2 that astronauts breathe out and convert it into sugar, which then they could use as a calorie source. 2 years later, we're actually building that system, and it will be on the International Space Station next year. However, we always knew that the bigger picture was if we could go from CO2 to other critical intermediates that are energy intensive to make. So that evolved into our mission, which is harnessing the power of nature, which is synthetic biology, to create economical, low carbon solutions for a sustainable future. So basically we have a portfolio of microbes that we have genetically engineered to use CO2 or methane as a feedstock and produce specific chemicals that we want them to. If you imagine these microbes as small advanced refineries that run very efficiently under ambient pressure and temperature, that's what this technology is about. And we have customized this synthetic biology platform specifically for applications of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. Now, let me give you an example to make all of this very tangible. Turns out that bananas in the ripening process produce ethylene. And we know the specific gene that is responsible for the ethylene forming enzyme. So we've taken that out of the banana and we put it in a host microorganism that uses CO2 as feedstock very efficiently. So now we have a superbug that could turn CO2 into bioethylene. We have finished phase 1 of this project, and now we're doing phase 2 for a scale-up. Our techno-economic assessment shows that we could utilize 1.7 megatons of CO2 per year from the flue gas to produce 1 billion pounds of bioethylene. And we could do this at a 30% lower cost than the incumbent method. That's because we're eliminating ethane as a feedstock. We're also eliminating hydrocracking, which is an energy-intensive and costly process. And we're also simplifying the post-processing. This project also qualifies for 45Q tax credits, but we do not include that in that 30% cost savings that is on here. Ethylene is just one example. We have about 30 other chemicals that we could make from CO2 or methane. And collectively, we believe that when scaled up, we could utilize up to 1 gigaton of CO2 per year by 2050 with our technology. Like all biological processes, a scale-up is always the main challenge. So from the very beginning, we have a special focus on techno-economic assessment, and we have created a seamless workflow for a scale-up from test tube all the way to fulfilled commercial plants. We're a team of engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs based in Houston, Texas, and we look forward to working with you in creating a low-carbon future for our industry. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the presentation. Do we have Moji on the line?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so let's kick it off with some questions. First off is what do your bioengineer bugs use as fuel to convert CO2 into ethylene?
As feedstock was the question?
Yeah. What do your bioengineer bugs use as fuel to convert CO2 into ethylene?
So if the question is referring to kind of as nutrient, a category of microorganisms that we actually use the carbon in the CO2 as their energy source. A category of the microorganisms that we have are photosynthetic, so they could also use light as a source of energy. For certain applications that if they're not using CO2, they would be using kind of sugar, which we could also make from CO2.
Mm-hmm. Great. So next question is, if you could tell us a bit about your commercial traction to date with potential clients.
Yeah, so the project that I showed here with ethylene, I could share that that's with Oxy, with OxyChem, and we finished phase 1, now we're doing phase 2. We have other projects also that are for other precursors to polymers and plastics. And part of our company that, I didn't have enough time to talk about here, but it's about innovations around subsurface applications of carbon capture, utilization, and storage with, new methods for CO2 sequestration and CO2 enhanced oil recovery. And we're doing pilots for those as well with other companies.
Awesome. Thank you. So the last question is, how much money have you raised and what are your upcoming milestones?
So I'm not sure if I could disclose the exact amount, but we raised a few $1 million for our seed round last year. And at the moment, we're also fundraising for our Series A.
Wonderful. Yeah, so if any of the attendees has any remaining questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box and Moji will be sticking to answer some of those. So yeah, up next, we have Heidi presenting with Opus 12.
Hi everyone, my name is Heidi Lim and I'm the Chief of Staff at Opus 12. We're a Berkeley-based company that has developed a technology to recycle carbon dioxide into chemicals, fuels, and materials. At a high level, our technology takes CO2 and water as inputs, and we use renewable electricity to split up those molecules and rearrange them in the presence of a novel catalyst membrane to make valuable products that are conventionally produced from fossil fuels today. We see an opportunity to address up to 3 billion tons of CO2 annually, which is about 10% of our industrial-related emissions, and turn those into valuable products that touch into a $300 billion petrochemical sector. These are our three co-founders. Kendra and Natasha were at Stanford at this chemistry lab where they discovered there are actually 16 different types of chemicals that can be produced in this process. They also learned what makes a good catalyst. And since then, we've scaled to about a 30-person team, and we have our own facilities in Berkeley, California. We have our first commercial systems available and scaling up to our industrial units now. Right now, we're focused on producing two products, first being carbon monoxide, which is the basis of many chemical products and materials such as polycarbonate, which is like the hard plastic on your taillights or your headlights of your car. It's also in electronics and many other different sectors. And polyurethane, which is a foam, such as the foam in a running shoe or the foam in a seat cushion. And then also jet fuel and other fuel products can be produced with CO, as well as other products. Ethylene is the basis of most modern plastics. So from now on, we'll have a lot of electric vehicles that need plastics in them. Ethylene could be the basis of those new types of plastics. One day, you'll be able to take a flight across the Atlantic on a carbon neutral flight, wearing clothing and carrying items that are actually made from CO2. We think about our CO2 impact in two ways. The first being the CO2 that's actually consumed in the process of making our products, and also the CO2 avoided because we're not using conventional processes. So for ethylene, for instance, that's about a 5-ton benefit. This is how we can impact large-scale emissions. We've raised over $20 million to date. We're currently raising a Series A round and happy to talk to others about fundraising and partnerships. Notably, on the commercial side, we've worked with Shell, IHI in Japan, and we also recently announced a partnership with Daimler, with the parent company of Mercedes-Benz, where we produced the world's first automotive part from CO2. This is only one of many materials that we can impact, and in an automobile, as well as other products that we're used to interacting with every day. Our core technology is a membrane that fits into an existing reactor design called a water electrolyzer. So we make these membranes and fit them into an existing reactor design. We have a manufacturing partner with one of the world's largest electrolyzer companies in the world, and this is how we scale up faster and take advantage of the high maturity and high energy efficiency of these systems. Today we have our dishwasher system number 1 here, where we're consuming kilograms per day of CO2, and we're scaling up to our megawatt system number 3 over the next 2 years, and at that size, we'll be able to address tons per day per unit. That is the modular scale for us to get to large-scale emissions at the hundreds or tens of thousands of tons per day of CO2. Our customer base is essentially companies that need to reduce their emissions, companies that can use the products that we can make, and large-scale renewables companies. So there's a large reach among those 3 categories. Thanks so much, and feel free to reach out to me after this. I'd be happy to connect. And again, we're raising a Series A and looking for partners.
Wonderful. Great. So thank you so much for your presentation. Do we have Heidi on the line?
Hi, yep, I'm here.
Perfect. Good evening. So we have a few questions coming in from the audience. First one is, are the end products CO and ethylene at cost parity to traditional methods for making them?
Yeah, great question. So there is actually a pathway to be on cost parity. It is one of the questions that we get often is, why are we doing this now? Why are we creating this technology today? And one of the reasons is because there's actually a trend where there are 3 cost declines that we're riding on right now. And those 3 cost declines are the cost of electrolysis, the cost of carbon capture, and the cost of renewable electricity. And so because of those 3 costs, those lower costs and continuing declining costs, we can actually be on cost parity and eventually potentially even cheaper than conventional methods.
Great. So yeah, next question from the audience is, can you speak to your IP and how it's protected?
Yeah. So our core technology is the membrane. And so that contains like our novel catalyst and kind of the other ways that we produce the methane. So that's, we do have some patents pending and also some IP out there. And then there's additional kind of secret sauce that we're not going to be posting IP about. But that's where our core technology is.
Great. Yeah, and the last question is, can you tell us a bit about your work with Shell and IHI?
Yeah, so we've had a lot of kind of partnerships on the R&D side with some of these companies. So IHI has supported our work in the ethylene side, and Shell has supported our work on the carbon monoxide development side, and they're particularly interested in fuels.
Great. So for the remaining questions, Heidi will be sticking to answer those to the Q&A box. So if you have any remaining questions, feel free to type those in. And thank you so much for joining, Heidi.
Great, thank you.
Perfect. So up next, we have Nino presenting Climeworks.
Hey there, my name is Nino. I'm a sales manager at Climeworks, and I want to show you why it is important to use air captured CO2 for your CCO process. What you can see in this picture is the world's first commercial direct air capture plant that we operate at the moment in Zurich, Switzerland. It consists of several so-called CO2 collectors. Each one of them, as you can see, has a fan attached to it. And what it does, it filters CO2 from the air around us. If we take a closer look, the basic principle behind such a collector is actually quite simple. So air is drawn into the collector, where a very special kind of filter material also very selectively only captures the CO2 molecules. In the second step, we add low-grade heat to that, which releases the CO2 again from the material. And then after that, we basically have two different kinds of products. So we have the pure CO2, the industrial gas, the physical gas that you can use for further processing. But we also have CO2-free air that we offer to our customers as a service. And this is what we called carbon dioxide removal, which is basically a premium carbon credit that we offer to private individuals and companies to reach their climate targets. How does carbon dioxide removal actually works? So this is the setup we have in Iceland. We have a Climeworks plant that filters CO2 from the air. That Climeworks plant is run by renewable energy from a geothermal power plant. The concentrated CO2 is mixed together with water and then pumped underground. There we have, due to the volcanic activity, we have first basaltic rock formation. This is very important with a lot of metal oxides in it. We also have high temperatures and high pressures on the ground. And these are factors that very much allows us to turn the gaseous CO2 that we captured from the air, turn that into carbonate minerals. So we turn CO2 from the air into stone. And as you can imagine, this process is very precise because we can, with the flow meter inside our direct air capture plant, we can measure exactly how much CO2 that we captured and then how much CO2 is permanently stored and safely stored away from the atmosphere. This is a picture of the geothermal power plant. You can see here you have the injection wells on the right side. You have we have a drill core. Gray is the basaltic rock with the different pores you can see inside that pores. Is the white spots. This are the carbonate minerals. So the CO2 turned into stone, and this process happens very fast. So within only 2 years, the CO2 is mineralized completely. If we're looking at CCU, we see the biggest potential in the production of renewable fuels in the future. And to produce these kind of fuels with direct air capture technology is actually quite simple. So you have a direct air capture plant at the beginning that provides the CO2. And on the other hand, you have, for example, an electrolyzer that provides the hydrogen, also renewably produced with renewable electricity. You put that together to form for the first time a liquid. So you have like a synthetic crude oil, so to say, and this crude oil can be refined within the existing refining infrastructure that we have from the big oil companies, and can be turned into different kinds of fuels: kerosene, gasoline, diesel, or basically all carbon-based products that we have today. So, for example, kerosene that is emitted during the combustion of an airplane, and the emitted amount of CO2 equals the amount that has been captured before, and therefore these kind of fuels are fully carbon neutral, fully circular. The main advantage of that of direct air capture CO2 for your CCU process is that we can close the carbon cycle with it. And why is that important? If we look into the future, by 2050, the world needs to reach net zero emissions, so we cannot emit a single ton of CO2 into the atmosphere anymore. So we need to go to a fully circular economy. And if we look at fuels that are produced from emission sources today, for example, from point sources, which are mainly carbon-based or fossil-based, sorry, they capture the CO2 and they turn it into a fuel, they recycle it, but then during the combustion, the CO2 is released again into the atmosphere. And this process accumulates still the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And yeah, by 2050, by reaching net zero, we cannot do that anymore. So these fuels need to come from a sustainable CO2 source like the air. Yeah, thank you very much. Happy to answer your questions.
So thank you so much, Nino, for the presentation. Do we have Nino on the line?
Yeah, I'm here. Hello, everybody.
Perfect. So we have a couple of questions here from the audience. Question number one is, what is the biggest challenge you are facing with direct air carbon capture, and how do you plan on addressing it?
Well, good question. Maybe there are a lot of answers to that, but I mean, the biggest challenge for direct air capture, I would say, is to become climate relevant, or at least that's our target. That's what we need to achieve to reach the 1.5 degrees target. Yeah, so we need to scale up the Climeworks, the direct air capture technology, to a scale where we really capture billions of tons of CO2 from the air, and this is a tremendous challenge. So, like, I mean, now we've already came really far. So from like 10 years ago, when Christoph and Jan, our founders, started in a lab capturing milligrams, now we're capturing several thousands of tons, but we have to go to billions of tons within, I don't know, only 20 or 30 years. So this is definitely the biggest challenge. And yeah, we're facing that challenge. We're building up the team, the infrastructure to reduce our plants. When I started 3 years ago, we were 30 people. Now we're over 100. So we're growing, and we want to scale up the technology to become climate relevant.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So next question is, who are your main customers or top paying clients?
Main customers, yeah, I mean, we have a collaboration with Audi Automobiles, the German car manufacturer. They have been an early supporter of our technology. They bought some of our direct air capture units to produce synthetic fuels, for example. We deliver CO2 to Coca-Cola, to carbonate beverages. We just sealed a deal with Stripe. They were the first ones to buy a larger amount of our carbon credits that I speak of in my presentation. And yeah, I would say these are the most important ones so far.
Wonderful. And last question is, can you explain a bit with more detail your business model? Yeah, well, the business model is also changing from time to time, or it changed within the years. I mean,
the main goal to become climate relevant, to have a technology that is able to combat climate change is still there. How we make money change from time to time, like I said. I mean, we started off as a pure technology supplier, so selling our direct air capture machines. But we came now to the point where we want to be a solution provider. So not only the technology, but also, as you can see on our website, we have a new digital business model. We sell the carbon credits through our web shop to private individuals and also directly to companies. So yeah, we have somehow a broad range, but like selling plants, selling the CO2 gas for CCU processes, but also selling carbon credits are, let's say, the three main business models that we're looking at.
Great, wonderful. So thank you so much, Nino, for joining. We really appreciate you joining at this time, especially considering the time zone. So we hope that you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Happy to talk to you guys, and yeah, you can contact me anytime if you have further questions. Thanks.
Perfect. So wonderful. So up next, let's kick it off with last but not least, with Pachama and Diego presenting.
Hello everyone, my name is Diego Saez Gil and I am the co-founder of Pachama, a technology company focused on forest as a solution for carbon capture and climate change. I'm going to share with you a brief presentation to explain a little bit more about our work and the role of forest on carbon capture. So Pachama is building a verified marketplace for forest carbon removal credits. And in one hand, we are building technologies harnessing satellite images, LiDAR data, and artificial intelligence to validate and monitor the carbon capture by projects that are either restoring or conserving the forest. And with that, we are providing higher assurance, transparency, and accountability on these projects. In the other side, we are building an online marketplace that allows for easy access to a wide variety of forest projects from around the world. And we try to make it very easy to support these projects with a lot of trust because you have access to all the information about the project. Now, why forest? Why did we decide to focus on forest as a solution for carbon capture? Well, it turns out that there are 2 billion hectares on the planet available for forest restoration and conservation that can remove up to 200 gigatons of carbon in the next 2 decades. In addition to all these opportunities for restoration of forest without competing with agriculture, forests have all these other co-benefits, such as protecting biodiversity and endangered species, supporting the livelihood of indigenous communities from around the world, and of course, providing other ecosystem services, such as water conservation and so forth. So now, what type of forest projects can receive carbon credit? Well, there are 3 types. Afforestation and reforestation is what is easy to imagine. We're planting trees and then 40 years into the future, we have all this biomass that sinks carbon into the land. But we can also conserve forest. And to do that, we need to determine what is the likelihood of deforestation of this land. And then what happens if we maintain this forest standing? What is the carbon that's going to be captured as a result of that? And then finally, improve forest management. This is for forests in which timber harvesting is allowed, but the project commits to keep the trees growing farther. And for the delta between this additional carbon capture, they can receive carbon credits. Now, how do we use technology to validate this? Well, we are building 3 remote sensing models. In one hand, we are analyzing with a historical model what happened in the past. What is the deforestation rate on this area? Secondly, we are building a verification model that allows us to determine with a high degree of precision how much carbon is there today on this forest. And then finally, we are building a monitoring model that allows us to know in real time the changes on the biomass. Are people deforesting the area? Are they harvesting? Are there fires on the forest? And with that, we can keep the project developers accountable and make sure that everybody is aware of what's going on in these projects. So how do we use artificial intelligence? Well, we train deep learning algorithms combining field plots carbon measurements with LiDAR scans taken by airplanes with satellite images of different sorts. And with these different data sources, the algorithms can train and then make predictions about how much carbon is there on a forest. We are working with an incredible group of technology companies that are making very strong steps towards supporting carbon capture projects. And we are made up of scientists, engineers, and founders who are very passionate about climate change and combining a lot of different skill sets to build this platform that we think are going to be very important to make sure that investments on forest carbon capture is done right. Our vision is that in the next decades, humanity derives enough funding to restore the forest that was lost, that not only can be a very meaningful source of carbon capture, but also a source of income, biodiversity protection, and just restoring the beauty of our planet, which we think that is what future generations deserve. So if you want to find out more about us, you can go to our website, pachama.com. You can email us to info@pachama. And of course, after this webinar, I'm going to be here to answer any questions you may have. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great. So thank you so much for the presentation, Diego. Do we have you on the line?
Yes, here I am. Thank you, Alberto.
Perfect. Wonderful. So first question, thanks for sticking around, by the way. First question from the audience is, the rainforest conservation approach to issuing carbon credits for an estimate of the amount of forest prevented from being lost seems highly subjective. How is this actually done, and can it be manipulated?
Well, that is precisely what we are trying to address by bringing this very objective way of measuring the actual carbon storage, the actual difference between the baseline of business as usual on a given region and what the project can produce. And we think that today with the great data that we count, coming from satellites, from LiDAR, from drones, that can be achieved. And doing that, we think that biomass can be measured, and therefore these systems, these frameworks can be a lot more precise than in the past.
Great. Wonderful. So the next question is, who are your main competitors? How do you differentiate from them? Are you aware of any?
Well, there are many organizations that have been working on developing forest carbon projects. We don't see them as competitors, we see them as partners. To those who have been developing forest carbon projects, we hope to provide our measurement and monitoring tools so that they can also improve the data and the transparency on the projects. There are other startups working on using remote sensing to measure forest. And we think that's great. There's a lot of different approaches to remote sensing that need to be experimented. And then finally, there are other startups focusing on building marketplaces for carbon offsets and carbon removals. And so we haven't seen anybody that is combining, the things that we're doing, the same that we're doing. But definitely we see a lot of action on nature-based solutions and a lot of interest from the market.
Great. And the last question to wrap up the day is if you can elaborate a bit on how you access land for reforestation.
On how do we, can you repeat the question, sorry?
Yes, how can you access land for reforestation?
How do we access land for the deforestation?
Yeah.
So the project developers that participate in these markets, sometimes they are nonprofit organizations that own land, like the Nature Conservancy, for example. Sometimes we are talking about private landowners that are changing the use of the land. Sometimes it's indigenous communities, sometimes it's governments as well. We think that with the data that we are producing in the future, we can have a data-driven approach to land purchase for the purpose of restoring or conserving forest and using that as a source of carbon capture. And so yeah, there is, as I said on the presentation, 1 billion hectares available for restoration. and it's just about knowing where to go for that land.
Great. Wonderful. So, I mean, overall, it was a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for sticking around. And I'm going to hand it back to my colleague Payal to kick it off with like final remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, Alberto, for the introduction. I'm Payal Patel and am director of our Houston office. It's been a pleasure to have Alex and Jim as our speakers, as well as all these great companies present. We do have a series of events planned for the rest of the year, and the next one is a Ask Me Anything virtual session co-hosted with Houston Exponential, which is a great startup development organization in town. If you'd like to attend this, go to houstonexponential.org/events and sign up for this. And then finally, again, thank you everyone for joining this webinar. If you'd like to keep in touch with all the activities we have going on, feel free to follow us on LinkedIn. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to my colleague Merritt or myself. Our contact info is written right there. And then I'm going to pass it back to Jim and Alex. We're trying out something new and having our speakers stay for any questions that the audience might have. They've been very gracious with their time, so passing it back to Alex and Jim.
Thank you.
Kyle, thanks so much. That was a really great group of startups. This is the kind of thing that makes me think that this sector is really going places when you hear from organizations like that. Alex, like any response from you? Like, were there one or two that like particularly caught your eye there?
Well, I'm friends
Before you dive
with
in, Alex, just to say quickly, like if the people in the audience have questions for Alex or myself, I am keeping an eye on the Q&A box, so send them over. Sorry,
yeah,
Alex.
No, please, I was just saying, I'm friends with a number of these companies. I think I've met with at least 3 of them personally, so I wish them all the best of luck. One of the folks had mentioned the kind of the need for scale up from going from pounds to tons, to millions of tons per annum to gigatons, and I think that was really the right perspective of thinking through any of these technologies. Doing a pilot is okay, and given that even the biggest biggest pilots right now are 1 million tons per annum, it's nothing, right? We need to get to 1 billion tons. So the perspective from the start is about how to scale, how to use manufacturing, I think is absolutely right. And I like what Opus was talking about as an example about using proven technology. All the pieces that they're talking about, I think they're right on. I think the question is, can they scale in the timeframes that needed?
Yeah. So one thing that I thought was interesting is a number of the startups talking about the role that carbon credits might play in their business models. Some of them said they could be sort of additional, like this is going to work anyway, and if we get income from credit payments, great. And others said, no, this is integral to the model. It doesn't really work unless we have corporations paying to offset via our processes. And I'm interested in that, like how, as an investor, like how do you see those things? If you see a company coming along and saying, actually, we really need carbon credits to make this work, is that something that you would be cautious about getting involved in? Are you seeing these technologies as having to compete with incumbents without any additional help from a credits market?
So certainly any VC is not going to be really particularly interested in a company that only can survive on carbon credits. The carbon credits need to be the cream on the cake. So I think we acknowledge that if carbon credits are very necessary in these early stages to help some of these companies get off the ground on the pilot side. But the challenge with carbon credits is that you can only use them once you've got your company on the ground and you're at scale. So where we would like to see more money as well is into this early stage research to be able to get more companies in the funnel. It's amazing of the just $1 billion that's gone into carbon capture and utilization just over the last about 10 years. So just 1 billion, I think about 70% has gone to like 7 or 8 companies, right? So think there's only been about 30, 40 companies that managed to raise any money. So we need to get this industry going to get hundreds of companies that are doing these different solutions. And I think then we have a much better chance of reaching that rather than worrying about the carbon credits at the end of the funnel when they're running the technologies.
So we had a question from Amrit Jalan it's kind of a continuation of my question about the offset. So you say, yes, offsets are useful for getting companies off the ground. But Amrit is asking, beyond that, what do you look for? When you're prospecting CCU companies, what are the kind of 2 or 3 key things that you're looking for in a prospective investment?
So we are looking for something that's fundamentally different that will allow either very large scale and quick deployments using, existing infrastructure, or a fundamental change in what they're doing to allow a breakthrough in the costs, right? Those are from the technology side. So one example on carbon capture, if, someone had an ability to take direct air capture to, let's say, call it even the $20 to $40 per ton range, that would be super exciting, because what that also means is that if you can do direct air capture at $20 to $40, then you can probably do flue gas capture at a couple of dollars, right? Because it's the amount of CO2 in flue gas is many times that of an atmosphere. So a company that can just get things down that far using direct air capture, even if they're just pursuing that, could really impact the rest of the industry. So that's very exciting. And then also bulk methods to be able to do some of these chemicals. So yes, as one of the speakers talked about, you can take hydrogen and to combine it with CO2 and clean power and all of that. Not everyone has the kind of the cheap geothermal energy for those types of pilots. So how do we make that accessible around the world so any country can develop its own renewable fuels at a cost lower than the existing fuels?
Great. And I'm intrigued by the fact you're saying you're cautious on infrastructure. You don't want these companies to have to rely on significant infrastructure creation in order to make them work. And that makes total sense to me. But I'm also, some of the visions that I find exciting as an analyst and not as an investor do involve the creation of the thing like Oxy's doing, is creating what they call a kind of carbon campus or a green campus, which marries direct air capture with enhanced oil recovery and utilization all on one site. It's a significant infrastructure investment. We've got other stuff coming out of some of the state governments who are looking to create networks of CO2 pipelines, so you can capture CO2 from heavy industry and send it either to a sequestration project, to an EOR project, or maybe to a utilization hub somewhere. So there are visions out there for significant infrastructure investment, but you're cautious about relying on them.
Yeah. So any technology that can utilize existing infrastructure is just going to move so much quickly. Specifically, let's look at Europe and the US. Getting right of way in the US right now is not easy. You have to condemn someone's land in order to do that under something called eminent domain. There are requests to get eminent domain lines for CO2 pipelines. Now, we talked about the public uproar. We can mention a number of cases where people are putting oil and gas pipelines through people's lands, and we've seen how that's worked out. That's basically the same thing with CO2 pipelines. So being able to use existing infrastructure, so as an example, being able to take natural gas pipelines out of service and convert those into CO2 pipelines, or even better into hydrogen pipelines. That's a better way, because you're not building out that infrastructure. And Europe has the same issue about building out new infrastructure. Also, just in terms of cost, if we can find technologies that can reuse existing infrastructure, then they can focus on reducing the main cost, like the CO2 capture cost and everything else, and worry about that aspect rather than trying to get money for other infrastructure.
Okay, so let's go to one more. So we have a question from Adak Belukar, and he's asking, what seems different in the newer generation of clean tech companies in CCUS compared to clean tech 1.0?
Oh, goodness. I don't think there were any real CCUS companies at Cleantech 1.0. I think that was mostly, I remember saying fuel cell companies and a lot of solar companies that went bust. I think one of the big differences we're seeing right now is there was a big focus, I don't know if it was Cleantech 1.0 or 2.0, I think we're in 3 now, is that there was a lot of focus on biological, so biofuels, and we're not seeing that right now. It seems it's CO2 into traditional areas such as steel, cement, normal fuels. We're not seeing, let's take CO2 as much into algae, into biofuels in that route, and that certainly I think has changed. I still think that's a very interesting place to be, especially around CO2 to algae and to protein, because protein, as we know, especially from meat and cows, is a big creator of methane. We need to get off the protein economy, as we talked about circular economy before. If we could take CO2, use that to replace different types of protein, that would have a huge circular economy and system impact.
Yeah. And one more from, this is probably the last one because we're pretty much out of time, but it's a great question. Peter Chargin is asking, what's the time horizon that investors have in these kind of technologies? Because a typical VC timeframe may not be practical here.
Yes. So if you look at who's investing into these, things like Bill Gates, Oxy, Shell, the Oil and Gas Climate Network, they all are investing as corporate investors, and they have a long timeline. The few venture institutional investors, they understand that these technologies, from let's call it seed or Series A to an exit, let's say an exit based on profitability, have typically been 15, 20-year timelines. And so investors need to be cognizant of those timelines, because you still always need to build a capital infrastructure around that. You need to do the test, you need to run these plants, and then you need to build the next size. And then there's typically at least 4 or 5 iterations of size until you get to what's a global scale plant that you can get that cost down, because no one's going to give you the $5 billion for your second or third iteration. So these things take time, and which is why when we talk to investors, it's like, you can't wait and think you're going to get into CCUS, in 5 or 10 years, because of the cycle of testing, especially when you look at safety and everything else, is a long time. So any company that wants to begin doing this, they need to be, piloting, testing, investing in R&D right now, with the knowledge of the time scales and the capital it's going to take to get to, billions of tons of removal.
Great, thanks so much, Alex. Really interesting to get those insights, and thanks to everyone who weighed in with questions. Alex, do you just want to, before we sign off, do you want to give your email again so people could follow up if they have questions?
Yes, well, it's Alex@Climate Impact Capital. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Rosenfeld that deals with climate. So looking forward to anyone's questions and to follow up individually.
Great, thanks, Alex. And I am jg@greenbiz.com if you want to follow up with anything. And Payal, do you want to say a few remarks before we wrap up, or are you ready to turn off the video?
Yeah, again, just thank you so much for your time, Alex and Jim. It's great to see, so many people, staying for this extra Q&A time. I guess, thanks for sharing your contact info. I'm sure many of the audience members will want to get in touch with you. We'll send a follow-up email to all registrants, which will also have your email addresses. So anyone in the audience, if for some reason you didn't get a chance to write down their contact info, we'll be sending an email in the next day or so. And so thank you again for your time, and have a good evening.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.